All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for Whisky Cask Investment. My name is Freeman, and I'm the whiskey specialist for the Whiskey Brokerage Rare Finds Worldwide. Today, we're going to cover the basics of if you consider investing in whiskey, whether you should pick investing in casks or investing in a bottle, and what are the key points that you should be aware of. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to just put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. I'll try to address them towards the end of the session. So here we go. Let's start our webinar. So first of all, to invest in whiskey, obviously we have to understand what is whiskey, what's the fundamentals, what sort of a drink is whiskey, what makes it a valuable asset in general. So in the very essence, whiskey is a distilled grain or malt spirit that has been aged in an oak cask for a minimum of 3 years. So obviously, with more than 250 years of Scotch whiskey history and heritage, there are a lot of different rules that defines what is whiskey, what is not, how to make it, what's the process, what sort of ingredients you can use, what you cannot. But the very essence of it is a grain or a malt spirit aged in an oak cask for a minimum of 3 years. However, the Scotch whiskey industry the Scotch whiskey regulations does define whiskey into 5 different categories, and we will go through them one by one. The first is blended whiskey. So blended whiskey is basically the largest segment of amongst all 5 categories. It contributes to 95% of the total consumption of whiskey and 75% of the value of whiskeys that are being consumed. It is pretty much the cornerstone of the entire industry, and they generally consist of cheap whiskeys that are priced below 500 Hong Kong dollars per bottle. Typical examples would be Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, Ballantine's, big brands like these. These brands are made by blending both grain and malt spirit together from more than one distilleries. So from various distilleries. That's what blended and blending fundamentally means. So it has to come from more than one distillery, and there's a mixture between both malt and grain. These whiskeys are generally not collectible, and they are not investment worthy. This is because they are created through a master blender to create a homogeneous product that appeals to the mass market, hoping to please most drinkers in the world, but they do lack the distinction from brand to brand. So although there are a lot of different brands of blended whiskeys, you will find them very homogeneous. Different brands do taste very similar, and there's not a lot of character to it, even though most of them are very easy to drink. So when we're talking about investing in whiskey, generally we are not referring to blended whiskey, even though they are the largest segments. So the next is the blended malt. So here, blended again means a mixture between whiskeys from various distilleries, so more than one distillery, and malt being it's 100% malt spirit, so there's no grain inside. Blended malt is a very small category. There's less than 1% of it. So it's not a topic that we will be focusing on today. Next, it's a blended grain. So again, blended means products from various distilleries, and grain meaning that it's 100% grain. There's no malt spirit inside. Once again, it's a very small category, and it's not something that we will be focusing on talking about today. Next, it's a single grain. So single being the opposite of blended means that it comes from one distillery only. So there's not a mixture between various distilleries. Even if there's a mixture, it's from products from only one distillery, and it's grains only. Once again, it's a very small category, and so it's not the focus of today. Last but not least, the focus of today will be single malt Scotch whiskey. Single meaning that it's coming from only one distillery, and malt being that it's 100% malt spirit. When people talk about collecting whiskey, when people talk about investing in whiskey, most of the time they are referring to single malts. The reason being that single malts coming from one single distillery, and there's more than 150 distilleries in malt distilleries in Scotland, with every single distillery having their own heritage, having their own history, the unique method of production, the unique materials that they use. Each distillery is known and perceived as having their very distinct character of how they taste, and they have their own story behind it. These kind of stories and these distinct tastes between products from different distilleries makes them very collectible and makes them a hobby for whiskey enthusiasts to actually pursue upon when they are collecting and trying out these different whiskeys. Because it's so collectible, because top critics, whiskey critics, top drinkers around the world do tend to buy and collect single malts, this drives up the prices in the secondary market and hence generally making it an asset that is worth investing. So, but of course, to invest in whiskey, we have to understand how it is made, and it's actually more simple than most people would think. The raw ingredient of whiskey is barley, malted barley. So the first step is of course harvesting barley from the farm. Once you have raw barley, it goes through a process called malting and tuning to become malt. The malt will then be ground into finer pieces through a mill. It is then steeped in hot water through a process called mashing to extract all the sugar contents inside to get a wort. Wort is basically a sugary solution. We then add in yeast for fermentation to get alcohol. It then goes through a still to increase its alcohol content to roughly around 70 to 80%. And then it gets slightly diluted to 60 to 70%. And it is then put into a cask for maturation. The maturation process takes a minimum of 3 years to be legally called Scotch whiskey. The alcohol level can also not drop, can also drop, but it cannot drop under 40%, or else it is not no longer legally Scotch whiskey. After maturation, it is then being bottled and turns into a drink. So when people invest in whiskey, they are either investing in either a bottle or an entire cask. And these two are drastically different approach. So if you're investing in the bottle, it's a purely speculation approach on buying whiskeys. The price fluctuation does rely on demand and supply, but for the past 10 years, whiskey has increased in value for roughly around 550% on average. With a lot of big winning bottles, of course, there are also some losers as well. So with the huge variety of bottles around the world, it does take someone with a considerable knowledge to pick the right bottles to invest, and the price fluctuation is generally much larger compared to casks. When one invests in a cask, it is generally a mid to long-term investment. These casks gain value from the maturation process and from gaining an additional unit on their legal age statements. So this is what we'll be focusing on talking about today. So when a whiskey is in a cask, its intrinsic value actually increases from the maturation process, meaning that it becomes a better drink, a better quality product year on year. As you hold on to the cask, the liquid inside the cask does absorb flavor from the wooden vessel, and the alcohol harshness dissipates away with time, making it a much more complex and pleasurable drink. But what really gains value on the market is the age statement. So for each and every year you age a cask of whiskey, its age statement increases, unlike a bottle. So if you buy a bottle of, for example, a Highland Park 18-year-old whiskey from the supermarket, no matter how long you hold on to it, it still stays an 18-year-old because the time spent in a bottle does not count. If you hold on to the cask, each and every year you hold on to it, its legal statement, its illegal age statement on documents increase, and you are able to charge a higher price in the market. It's also worth noting that since you cannot age a cask of whiskey indefinitely, these whiskeys, there's natural scarcity caused by the physical limitations of aging due to evaporation. So each and every year you age a cask of whiskey, it loses around 2% of the content, and also it loses around 0.5% of the alcohol strength. Meaning that if a cask of whiskey starts at roughly around 75 65% alcohol by volume ratio, the maximum lifespan of a cask of whiskey is around 40 years. Most whiskeys do not actually survive beyond 40 years old. Therefore, making all the whiskeys that actually survive beyond 30, 35, 40 exponentially rare as its age increases. It's also worth noting that the aging of whiskey is independent to the market conditions. No matter whether the stock market goes up or goes down, whether the economy goes better or goes worse, it still produces value from its increase in age statement silently in the warehouse that ages it. So it acts as a natural hedge towards the market. Historically speaking, a cask appreciates around 15 to 20% per year as it ages. Of course, at Rare Finds Worldwide, we do tend to stick to rare casks of whiskey, rare items, high quality spirits from renowned distilleries. So most of them do actually beat the average of 15%. A lot of casks we traded during 2020 actually have performed at the rate of 25 or 30% per year. So a lot of people are actually curious about how whiskey has been performing during the pandemic. It's worth noting that investors and high net worth individuals around the world does treat whiskey as a risk-averse asset. Again, since it does act as a natural hedge towards the uncertain economy, whiskey performance during the 2020 actually outperforms most assets around the world and has reached a historical high. It's also worth noting that even during the financial crisis in 2008, whiskey, right after the whiskey's crisis, right after that during 2009, still reached record high during that time. The pandemic actually broke out roughly during February 2020, but the auction prices that we have observed during August 2020, May 2020 have still been reaching record high and has been the highest ever. So I think most investors can actually feel comfort about their assets that they are holding in the form of whiskeys have been performing very well during market stress and during uncertainty. Of course, the F&B industry has not been doing well, so a lot of people would imagine whiskey prices should go down with the F&B industry performing really, really badly during lockdown. This is actually partly true. If we look at export volume, whiskeys in 2020, Scotch whiskey has actually recorded the first time ever of decrease in export volume in 10 years' time during 2020. So for the past 10 years, every single year, it's been roughly around 5% increase steadily every single year for Scotch whiskey exports volume. However, in 2020, it was a negative 13% decrease. But still, auction prices have been recorded a 25% increase on average during 2020. This means that despite lower whiskey consumption in the blended whiskey, in the lower end whiskey market, high-end whiskeys, investment grade whiskeys have been considered as an asset, have been performing better than ever. I hope this does answer the question on whether whiskey is performing well in the pandemic period, and the answer is definitely yes. So to have investment in whiskey, of course, we have to understand the market ecology. Who are the people producing the whiskeys and who are we actually buying them from? So the fundamental unit producing these whiskeys are the distilleries. But of course, these distilleries, understanding the power of aging and forecasting future demands, they will often produce more whiskeys than they actually sell every year. This is because if they produce whiskeys this year, these whiskeys have to be aged in a cask for 10, 12, 15 years before they're released into the market as a single malt. Needing the cash flow, these distilleries would sell these casks to independent bottlers and to private and individual investors. Independent bottlers are basically companies that do not own distilleries, they do not produce spirits, but still they buy spirits and bottle them in the form of their own trademark. And we refer these to as IBs, independent bottlings, as opposed to the opposite OBs, official bottlings. Official bottlings meaning that the bottles are released directly by the distilleries, and IBs meaning that these bottles are released by independent bottlers. These independent bottlers would often also sell these casks to private individuals for the cash flow, and to institutional investors or to private clients who want to bottle their own whiskies. This makes up a secondary market where the casks have left the distilleries, are no longer under the control of distilleries, but they are free to trade assets within the market. And this is where individual investors who invest in casks of whiskies are operating in. In order to value a cask of whiskey, the most important factor is to make the right comparisons. Unfortunately, for casks, it's unlike the stock market where there are a lot of indices and also the price are within reach as long as you click on the internet and do a Google search. However, what is apparently very, very transparent are retail bottle prices in the market. Therefore, in order to find out whether a cask is worth buying, whether a cask is at good value, we often compare the per bottle price of a cask, the average bottle price of a cask, to the retail counterparts in the retail market. And to make the right comparisons, you have to find the closest comparable in the market. And there are a few factors that you have to bear in mind. First, you always compare single malt, single cask whiskies. So the casks that you buy are unlikely to be blended, and they are unlikely to end up in mass production. They are always going to be bottled in single casks. Therefore, to make the right comparisons, you have to find single cask whiskies in the market. So a regular bottle of, let's say, Macallan 12-year-old you find in a supermarket are created by blending hundreds and hundreds of casks of Macallan 12-year-old together in a gigantic vat, and they are hence mass produced. They are not limited in any sort of way. A single cask bottle, meaning a bottle that comes from only one cask, meaning that there's only 300 or 400 bottles of the same liquid that exist in the world. Hence, fundamentally, they are generally more expensive. So the casks that you buy will always end up as a single cask in the market. Therefore, you have to compare them with single cask bottles in the market as well. The second factor is that you always only compare to IB prices, independent bottling prices. OB prices and IB prices are very different due to the difference in marketing strategy and due to the difference in branding. So cheap OBs are always much cheaper. The basic OB low age OB bottles are always cheaper than the same age IBs. But the high-end old age OBs are always much more expensive than IBs of the same age. Since all the casks that you buy will be IBs, therefore you always find IB prices to compare with only. The third factor is you do not compare prices with antique bottles. Antique bottles meaning, for example, a Highland Park 18-year-old that's bottled during the 1980s. This is because since these bottles are always out of circulation, and through time, most of them have been consumed, and they, even though when they first released, they're not limited, now they are extremely, extremely limited, and there are only very few bottles circulating in the market. And due to historical value, these bottles are always much more expensive than the modern bottles of the same age. So in order to compare with the correct, with the right comparables, you find modern bottles that have been bottled within the past 10 years, IBs and single cask, and you compare them with the casks that you tend to buy, and you will realize whether your cask is actually worth buying and get a good valuation on the cask. So this is just a very simple model, which we refer to as a DCI model, that we help people find the casks that they want to buy. D refers to drinker, C collector, and I investor. So the sweet spot where the entire model hits simultaneously would be middle-range casks with a high ABV, where it appeals to most all categories of cask buyers. Drinkers, of course, they care about the quality of the drink, maybe not as much as the brand name or the age. Collectors, they want to find something unique. They want a top-notch distilleries, and they want it to be good value. And whereas investors always care about the brand name and always cares about the ABV, whether there is an aging potential for the cask. But no matter which category of cask buyer you are, we always recommend people to stay away from cheap spirits that are 0 to 3 years old from unknown distilleries. This is because without a track record, it's hard to value these casks. And with 0 to 3 years old, even though they are incredibly cheap, it takes an immense amount of patience for one to actually age the cask to a considerably drinkable age. It takes 10, 15 years a minimum for this cask to be attractive in the market. Hence, the investor would have to stuck with it for an incredible amount of time, as compared to decently aged casks, which are always liquid assets in the market, and you can always sell whenever you want. So there are a lot of factors affecting the price of the cask, but the most important factor of all would be either the distillery and the age. The distillery tells you a lot about the cask, as it indicates the spirit quality, the marketing tactics, ownership, the history and the romance behind and the stories behind. It does take considerable knowledge to be familiar with every single distillery in the world, but here's where our expertise does come into play, and we will give you the right advice on that. The next factor is the age. So age is very simple. The older is always higher price. So in terms of the taste, in terms of the quality, it's very subjective. Some people might enjoy younger whiskey. Some people might enjoy older and more elegant, easy to drink whiskey. However, when it comes to investment, older always means higher price. Therefore, with patience, as long as you're willing to hold on to a cask and actually age it to a popular and considerable age, you will always gain value on your assets. The next important factor would be the cask type. So most popular cask type would be either sherry or bourbon, with sherry contributing to 10% of the market and bourbon the other 90%. Both of these are the main, most of the casks being used in the market. Sherry obviously is slightly more expensive. It's roughly around 10 to 20% more expensive as the bourbon counterpart, given the same age. Other types of casks would be wine, rum, and beer casks, which contributes to less than 1% of the market. Even though these casks are quite rare, they do not necessarily be more expensive in the market due to the fact that not a lot of people actually sought after it, as it's not the mainstream most popular options, but sometimes they do provide some novelty value, so they are still good investment options. Vintages, unlike wine, is not very important for whiskeys. It's only used to calculate the age. There's no sort of great vintages or shit vintages in whiskeys. It's all about the age. The older, the higher price. ABV does not actually affect the price that much. However, it does affect the aging potential. The higher the ABV, the longer you can age the cask for. So this is an example of a cask offer, what a cask offer generally looks like. When you receive a cask offer, obviously you have the name of the distillery, you have the vintage. AYS refers to the date that it's actually being distilled and being filled into a cask. This is in 1995. You know that this whiskey is currently 26 years old. Next year it's going to be 27. Next year it's going to be 28. Cask type, first fill sherry hogshead, sherry being what's the cask recently, last time being filled with. First fill meaning that it's the first time it's being filled with whiskey, and hogshead is the shape of the cask, which we'll cover later. ABV 56.2%, meaning that it's roughly still have around 10 to 15 years time to age before it gets too low. RLA 95. RLA means regauge liters of alcohol. This number refers to the liters of pure alcohol within the cask. Estimated number of bottles tells you about the liquid volume of the cask, and hence the cask price, and hence the per bottle value. Cask obviously comes in all kinds of all kinds of shapes and sizes, but then we do not recommend buying casks with a very, very tiny size for investment. This is because tiny size casks are made specifically to increase the rate of maturation. They are not ideal for long-term holding, long-term maturation. Usually liquid being filled into these casks are for cask finish, and they fill in for 1 to 2 years before they are being bottled. The most common standard of casks would be American standard barrel and hogsheads, which are roughly around 200 to 300 liters. And then you have larger casks like quart pipes and gigantic casks like sherry butts and sherry puncheons, which can yield up to 800 to 900 bottles sometimes. There are obviously a lot of different distilleries in the world. Just to cover some, the blue chips currently would be Macallan, Bowmore, and Dalmore. These would be the top leading distilleries that are achieving the best prices, the highest prices around the world, and there's no sign of them stopping anytime soon. Front runners include Lafroy, Springbank, Clyneish, Ardbeg, so on and so on. These would be whiskeys that have been appreciated, I think, at a rate really, really fast, and they're catching up with the blue chips. Of course, you have a lot of solid and strong options, Cooler, Highland Park, Woodhaven, just to name a few. These will be distilleries with a long history, strong fan base around the world, but they are not incredibly hyped, but they are very steady and solid investment options. And if you are generally a more speculative investors, you can consider rising stars like Glenelgan, Glenkeith, Lechick, Benriens, Bennevis, so on and so on. If you're not a whiskey enthusiast, there's a chance that you have never heard of any of these brand names. However, they are incredibly popular right now in the independent bottling market and amongst top connoisseurs around the world. And we believe they would be, any one of them would have the chance of blowing up soon. And due to the fact that they are not heavily hyped up, a lot of them are still priced very reasonably, hence making them the perfect speculative options for people with a lower budget. Once you're interested in buying a cask, of course, we'll help you establish the reason and the goals where you want to achieve. After you've chosen a cask, we will take care of the entire process of purchasing, acquiring the cask, and the relevant legal documents that are being involved. All these casks will be stored and matured in HMRC bonded warehouses in Scotland. Once you find the right time to sell, we will broker the sales of your cask, meaning that we will find a buyer to buy your cask, and you can just sit back and receive the cash. There's a chance we might also put your cask into auction if it's a high-end cask, because high-end casks usually achieve much better prices in high-end auctions. All casks that we take on board can achieve more than 15% a year generally, and a lot of them actually have beaten 20% to 25% per year in terms of their per value gain in 2020. Once you've bought your cask, you can actually draw a sample for it. You can visit your cask. You can rewrap the content into a different cask, which is something people really love to do nowadays. Very popular option to get extra color and extra flavor. We do recommend doing an annual or biannual regauge of your cask just to keep track of the content. We cover the storage and insurance costs for you for the first 3 years. And after the first 3 years, it's £65 a bottle. So very minimum maintenance costs that you do not have to worry about. So that's all for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to drop us an email. And every one of you who have attended the webinar, we will have someone to call you back for some feedbacks and to see whether you are interested to going forward, seeing some cask options and going ahead. If not, that's totally fine as well. I can see you guys again in the future, and please keep in touch with us, and thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.